Has this ever happened to you? You're playing Grand Theft Auto 5, merrily criming your way across the city, racking up those wanted stars like nobody's business. You get on a wild police chase with helicopters and dozens of cars, you're tossing grenades left and right. There's no way the entire city isn't on lockdown with Michael DeSantis' face on every TV screen. Then the cops finally catch up with you and send you to the hospital, so you decide you've had enough fun and should continue the story. So you then start a cutscene and Michael openly and suavely scouts out a jewelry store for an upcoming heist, and nobody bats an eye. Obviously this makes no sense if you're trying to be immersed. You might even use that dreaded two-word phrase, ludonarrative dissonance. So dreaded that making fun of how overused the term is has itself become overused. For those who somehow missed all the discourse around it, its use in games criticism basically means the narrative of the game is at odds with how the game is played in some way. Like a character who kills a ton of people in gameplay freaking out after killing someone in a cutscene. Or, a character in an open world game going on a rampage only for the story to ignore it. It's jarring. Strange, right? And what if a game did it on purpose? I'm gonna throw some Russian formalist literary theory at you real quick. Don't worry, it's just introductory definitions of two concepts. They are fabula and sujet, coined by Vladimir Prop and Viktor Shklovsky in the early 1900s. They respectively describe the distinction between the events of the story being told in their objective in-universe chronology and the method through which a given work of art chooses to tell that story. The go-to examples people use to explain this are Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino films, since those guys love their non-linear storytelling. The sujet of Memento is the scenes in color being shown backwards, while the fabula is the chronological timeline of Leonard Shelby's investigation in the order it actually happened within the story world. The sujet of Pulp Fiction is the movie as presented, opening at the diner, Vincent and Jules going to the apartment, Vincent's outing with Mia Wallace, Butch's flashback to Christopher Walken, Butch trying to flee from Marcellus Wallace, Vincent and Jules dealing with accidentally killing Marvin, and lastly, Vincent and Jules encountering Pumpkin and Honey Bunny at the diner from the beginning. The fabula, the objective events in their in-universe chronology, is the scene with Christopher Walken, Vincent and Jules going to the apartment, them dealing with killing Marvin, then their encounter with Pumpkin and Honey Bunny, then them returning to Wallace, then Vincent's date with Mia, and finally Butch fleeing from Wallace. Typically, the sujet-fabula distinction relates to linearity or non-linearity, but I've also seen it used in contexts where a film features dream sequences or other forms of subjective, altered perception. In these contexts, the sujet is the distorted perspective of an unreliable narrator, while the fabula is the objective facts of the story that the sujet is filtering. Maybe this is a different concept though, and fabula and sujet would be the wrong terms for this situation. Russian formalists, please let me know. Being concepts originated in the early 20th century, they were not developed at a time when video games existed. But the interactive medium introduces a particularly sizable complication to this concept. In video games that feature the sort of ludonarrative dissonance I opened with, typically cinematic, story-driven open-world or action video games, we see an example of a sujet that is completely detached from fabula. No matter what happens in the gameplay, the cutscenes unfold the same way. Therefore, in these games, the sujet is split into two: a conventional cinematic sujet that conveys the events of the fabula through cutscenes and dialogue within story missions, and the gameplay sujet, an alternate world entirely, a contained space where the player of the game can indulge in any number of destructive whims that have zero reflection in the fabula. Open-world games are all about freedom, but within their very structure they limit this freedom, section it off, and relegate it into the realm of the unimportant when it comes time for narrative. It's almost patronizing, at least from a game of such a genre with serious storytelling aspirations. This is, I think, part of the backlash to the game design of a developer like Rockstar, as articulated by exercise ball enthusiast Naked Jacob. In Grand Theft Auto 5, there is a real Michael DeSanta, or Franklin Clinton, or Trevor Phillips, and then there is you, the player, who can only ever embody false versions of each of them, the versions that don't really count. The distinction between gameplay GTA protagonists and cutscene GTA protagonists is widely acknowledged. You may ask, why apply old literary theory terms when people already recognize this difference? Well, I wanted to draw attention to the uniqueness of this phenomenon within the larger spectrum of arts. The sujet is never really sundered like this in any other medium. Even if we accept unreliable narrators and dream sequences into the definition of sujet, they are still reflected into the fabula most of the time by virtue of the fact that within the fabula, the perspective character has the warped view or visions that we are presented. Even that connection does not exist with an open-world sujet. Players simply accept that the vast majority of their playtime does not matter within the stories of these single-player, ostensibly story-driven games. Most of the time spent engaging with such a piece of art is with material that is not canon to itself. We are forced to ignore this breach if we want to feel immersed in the story or enjoy the raw gameplay. Now, I am focusing on cinematic, open-world games here. Other game genres that are either lighter on story or are more built to accommodate player choice are not necessarily at odds with themselves in the same way, though such friction is inevitable in any game with a fail state. A game like Dishonored reacts to the player's decisions in the gameplay to meld sujet with a malleable fabula, unless of course you die or keep reloading when you get caught. Interactive art is often the most immersive for its interactivity, but looking at the sujet-fabula distinction, it may at the same time be the least. It consistently presents those engaging with it sections that must be consciously ignored in order to improve narrative cohesion of the experience. Now, we don't need to change the medium to eliminate failure states all for the sake of pure immersion. We don't need more Beyond Two Soulses, and we definitely don't need the whole medium to be made up of them. In fact, I'm suggesting we do the opposite. Let's lean into it. Let's get experimental. 4 years ago, Patricia Taxon posited,
"The act of establishing a rule or convention in regards to art or artistic practice will necessarily result in the implicit formulation of an equal and opposite anti-convention."
When we learn a rule in art, we must also implicitly learn what happens when you break that rule. Instead of a new rule to live by, we've been given a crossroads.
Any developer making an open-world game is at a crossroads when it comes to how to address the sundered sujet. Most choose to ignore it, to trust the player to accept their walled-off play area and live with the two sujets alongside each other. Some, like Assassin's Creed, take the route of trying to smooth things over. Any glitch in an Assassin's Creed game is really a glitch in the animus, because the game filters its presentation by being a simulation in fiction. If you make Ezio go on a story-breaking rampage, the fact that it's not what the real Ezio did is already accounted for and acknowledged within the narrative. A lot of open-world games recently, those in the model of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, have shifted away from the primarily cinematic model that was so popular in the late 2000s and 2010s, partially sidestepping this problem entirely. But open-world games have another path at the crossroads, one far less traveled. Lean into the rupture. Pull an Undertale, a Stanley Parable, and make a narrative that directly confronts the weird split in the sujets. Sure, sometimes experimentation yields a failure. While I personally enjoyed all of Inscription, I understand the popular criticism that it would be better without all the meta stuff it introduces. Last of Us 2 was about making you absolutely hate a character, then using the unique medium of video games to put you in her shoes and try to force you to empathize with her, which made player frustration and backlash from those who couldn't inevitable. And then, of course, there's Yick.
You tell me what the hell is going on?
But such failures will allow game makers overall to refine their approaches, learn from mistakes. That's what pushes the medium forward. There are so many innovations yet to emerge in gaming, and experimentally leaning into the open-world split sujet may help us find some. What might this look like? I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is making a narrative in which the gameplay version of a protagonist becomes aware of the alternate cutscene version, and has an existentialist struggle about who they are, what their worth is, and maybe even tries to invade the cutscenes. They'd rage against the meaninglessness of their efforts in their gameplay reality that they can never change, while watching their cutscene self actually experience change, live the life they want while wearing the same face. Gameplay protag could try to escape through intentionally failing objectives and story missions. Cutscene protag could trap their alternate self in weaponized cutscenes. There's a lot of thematic potential in exploring alienation, powerlessness, self-image, the value of a person, and more. But that's not the only story you could tell with my basic idea. When I conceptualize meta-stories, they tend to be very direct in their meta-ness, but there's absolutely more expressionistic or symbolic avenues to take, more abstract approaches than I am capable of thinking of, and those would probably be better anyway. Unfortunately, the way the industry is now, it is highly unlikely such an experiment can occur. Open-world games are incredibly expensive, perhaps the most expensive type of game there is. This means that the only studios that can really make them at the scale most gamers expect are the big players, the giant publishers. But the big publishers are the most timid, the most risk-averse, the least innovative in anything other than graphical realism, because there's too much money involved to risk being creative. While some genuine innovations may slip through the cracks of the paradigm, like the Nemesis system from the Middle-earth games, these are rare. Even Nintendo, which is generally more innovative than Ubisoft or EA, but that's a fairly low bar for them to clear, indulge in the industry-wide habit of iterating more than innovating if a game becomes a franchise. So I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for the next Grand Theft Auto, Saints Row, Far Cry, or Shadow of whatever to do anything experimental with their storytelling. Even their cinematography is so often the most basic shot-reverse shot. If they won't even steal experimental techniques from films that someone else already came up with, how can we expect them to experiment themselves? Big-budget corporate games have their place in the game development ecosystem when it comes to advancing available technology, but they are mostly incapable of advancing games as an art form in the way that indie and mid-budget games are. The Last of Us 2's attempt at experimentation was an aberration within the AAA landscape, and the potently toxic backlash it suffered is something that studios try to avoid because it might get in the way of turning a profit on their bloated offerings. So we must turn to indie games, to the Neon Whites, the Shadows of Doubt, the Superliminals, the Outer Wildses. But by their nature, they lack the budgets that a cinematic open-world game normally requires. In the indie space, an open-world game usually means something like Stardew Valley, which is good in its own right, but a different thing altogether. It could also mean a game like Sable or Paradise Killer, beautiful works of art that I love, but still not the same thing, both being deliberately devoid of other entities to interact with in ways beyond dialogue boxes. No, for the kind of experimentation I'm suggesting, we would need someone with the resources to build a cinematic open-world game, but the artistic drive and freedom to toy with the medium. We would need... But I suspect he's very busy. And we could really use more people like Kojima, instead of just deifying one guy. There is another possibility. The niche success of Crow Country, with its aesthetic throwback to the PlayStation 1, made me think of an adjacent way to create a cinematic open-world game on a budget. After all, the beginnings of the genre can be traced back to the PlayStation 2, and recreating that aesthetic style and scale of world is surely more manageable nowadays than chasing cutting-edge realism. This could be the way to make an affordable game that meets all the criteria I've been pitching. And then, just as I was about to record this, I started playing Chia, an actual indie open-world game that is smaller in scope, but still quite impressive. Maybe there's more hope than I thought. As has been pointed out many times, video games are an art form still in their childhood. So much of the unique language of this interactive medium has yet to be developed, and the most powerful, dominant publisher corporations have no economic interest in helping it grow in any way beyond finding ways to squeeze more money out of it. So they borrow filmic convention and stagnate. But that just makes it all the more important for creatives and fans within the space to imagine what could be. Sometimes it means you remembered a concept from Russian formalism that you learned about in a college film class several years ago, and you started wondering how that concept changes when applied to games. Other times it means seeking out the inventive and exciting, or making it for yourself if you happen to know how to code, which I don't. But we can all dream. I'm not demanding some random developers make my specific pitch. I'm not even really saying somebody needs to directly play with this open-world sujet concept. I'm also not saying that no open-world games can be conventional anymore. I just wanted to demonstrate a thought experiment to provoke new avenues of creative expression. Your idea may be way better than mine. Just don't let yourself be tricked into thinking gaming is dead when Call of Duty or Destiny is mediocre again, or when yet another live service game flops. They are not the pioneers.